17,000 feet below the Philippine Sea, something waits in permanent darkness. The USS Cavala's war diary says it should be there. A carrier longer than 2 football fields, carrying 1,200 men and the pride of an empire. But 80 years after 3 American torpedoes tore through her hull, no one's actually seen her. The coordinates are precise. The Navy logged the hits. The Japanese confirmed the loss. So why does the world's most advanced carrier still hide from every camera we send down? Shokaku wasn't just any aircraft carrier. She was the lead ship of Japan's most sophisticated class, built to project imperial power across an ocean the size of all Earth's land masses combined. Launched from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in 1939, after Japan walked away from the Washington Naval Treaty limitations, she measured 257 meters bow to stern with armor thick enough to shrug off conventional bombs. Her turbines could push 34 knots, faster than most destroyers hunting her. She carried 72 aircraft and enough aviation fuel to sustain operations 1,000 miles from any friendly port. The engineering blueprints, preserved in Japan's National Diet Library, show ventilation systems designed for tropical operations and reinforced flight decks meant to absorb punishment. Her sister ship, Shokaku, shared the same design philosophy: speed and range over defensive depth. Both were purpose-built for the kind of war Japan planned to fight. Fast strikes across vast distances, hitting American bases before they could organize a response. She was present at Pearl Harbor, her aircraft among the first wave that caught the Pacific Fleet at anchor. 27 Kate torpedo bombers and 18 Val dive bombers launched from her deck in pre-dawn darkness, navigating by stars to find Oahu's coastline. They hit Battleship Row while men were still eating breakfast. Her pilots returned with gun camera footage of the Arizona exploding, the Oklahoma capsizing, the Nevada trying to escape and failing. The strike made her crew legends in the Imperial Navy. It also marked every man aboard for American revenge. She traded blows with American carriers at Coral Sea in May 1942, taking 3 bomb hits that should have sent her to the bottom, but didn't. One penetrated her flight deck and detonated in the hangar, killing 108 men and starting fires that took 6 hours to control. Another hit aft, destroying repair facilities her crew would desperately need later. A third struck near her island superstructure, wrecking radar equipment Japan couldn't replace. Her damage control teams kept her afloat through flooding that would have killed a lesser ship, using wooden beams to shore up bulkheads and pumping seawater by hand when machinery failed. She survived Guadalcanal, when half the combined fleet went to the bottom, limping back to Truk for repairs that took months because Japan's shipyard capacity was already stretched beyond breaking. Welders worked in shifts around the clock, replacing hull plates with whatever steel they could scavenge from merchant ships that would never sail again. She returned to service in early 1943, but she was never quite the same. The repairs were competent but hasty. Welds that should have been X-rayed weren't. Compartments that should have been waterproofed got painted over instead. But those same blueprints reveal something the Imperial Navy never advertised to its crews. The fuel distribution system that gave her range also made her a floating bomb. High-octane aviation gas ran through pipes mere inches from crew quarters, with vapor venting that met peacetime specifications, but not the reality of torpedo damage. Every gallon that extended her operational radius also increased the explosive yield waiting inside her hull. The naval architects knew. Internal memoranda from Yokosuka, declassified in the 1970s, show engineers raising concerns about fuel pipe routing during the design phase. They were overruled by admirals who prioritized operational range. You couldn't project power across 5,000 miles of ocean with a cautious fuel system. You needed capacity. You needed flow rates that could refuel an entire air group in under 2 hours. And you accepted that if enemy ordnance breached those systems, the ensuing fire wouldn't just damage the ship, it would erase it. American carriers like Enterprise had different design priorities: isolated fuel bunkers with blast-resistant walls, redundant pumping stations so damage to one system didn't compromise the entire ship, compartmentalization that treated every gallon of avgas as a potential bomb, and engineered accordingly. They'd learned from the British, who'd lost carriers to magazine explosions in the Mediterranean, and redesigned everything afterward. Shokaku's designers made a different calculation. They built a weapon that could reach Pearl Harbor from Japanese waters, strike, and return without refueling. But they built it out of volatile components held together by doctrine that assumed Japanese carriers wouldn't get hit. The assumption held for Pearl Harbor. It held through the Indian Ocean raids in early 1942. It failed at Coral Sea and never recovered, which means when Cavala's fish hit on June 19, 1944, what happened next wasn't just bad luck. It was engineered into her from the day her keel was laid. The official Japanese loss report lists 3 torpedo impacts. Survivors reported 4 distinct explosions, each progressively more violent than the last. The difference matters because one of those blasts erased entire sections of the ship that should be down there, sections that would tell us whether she died from American weapons or from her own design failures. And if the wreck is ever found, the damage pattern will tell us which version of that final day is real. The Battle of the Philippine Sea turned the Imperial Navy's last carrier offensive into a slaughter so one-sided, American pilots called it a turkey shoot. But Shokaku's destruction happened away from the aerial carnage, in a submarine ambush that still doesn't add up. Declassified logs from the USS Kavala, held at the National Archives, show Commander Herman Kostler tracked Shokaku for 3 hours on June 19, 1944, waiting for her destroyer screen to open a gap. She was steaming at 20 knots, as part of Vice Admiral Jusaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet heading toward the Mariana Islands to intercept American invasion forces. Kavala had been trailing the formation since dawn, staying deep to avoid detection, surfacing only long enough to update firing solutions. At 12 on 20 hours, the destroyer screen shifted to investigate a sonar contact 3 miles north, possibly another American submarine, possibly a whale, possibly nothing. It gave Kostler a 30-second window. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes from 1,200 yards, a point-blank range for submarine combat. 3 hits were confirmed by sonar, distinct metallic impacts picked up by Kavala's hydrophones as she dove to evade counterattack. The sonar operator's log describes them as solid hits, amidships and forward, heavy breaking up noises immediately following. The carrier's radio transmission, intercepted by American listening stations and translated post-war, reported flooding in the forward elevator pit and engine room number 2. Standard damage control for a Shokaku-class ship. Her watertight compartments were designed to isolate exactly that kind of damage. She had pumps that could handle thousands of gallons per minute. Her crew had trained for it since commissioning. Her design could handle it. But at 12:32, just 12 minutes after the torpedo impacts, a massive secondary explosion blew out her port side amidships. Kavala's crew heard it from 300 feet below the surface and 2 miles away. It was a deep, rolling detonation that rattled their hull plating hard enough that men thought they'd been depth-charged. One sonar operator, in a post-war interview for Naval Institute Archives, described it as sounding like a boiler letting go inside a cathedral, this deep boom that just kept echoing. Surface observers on nearby destroyers reported a fireball that rose 300 feet above the flight deck, visible from 10 miles away. Black smoke poured from her hangar bays. Aircraft parked on deck, bombers being prepared for the afternoon strike, ignited from radiant heat alone, aiding their fuel and ordnance to the conflagration. At 15:01, 2.5 hours after that secondary blast, she rolled over to port and vanished bow first into the Philippine Sea, taking 1,272 men with her. Between the torpedo hits and that secondary explosion, something turned manageable damage into catastrophic failure. The American assumption was simple. Torpedoes ruptured fuel lines. Vapors accumulated in unventilated spaces below decks. A spark from damaged electrical systems, or a ruptured steam pipe ignited the cloud. Clean causality. Battle damage plus design flaw equals inevitable result. The Navy's post-battle analysis filed it as a textbook submarine kill, proof that American torpedoes, finally fixed after the defective Mark 14 debacle early in the war, worked as designed, except eyewitness accounts from her escorts, the destroyers Wakatsuki, Hatsuzuki, and Akizuki, compiled by CombinedFleet.com from post-war interviews with surviving Japanese sailors, describe the blast coming from aft of the torpedo damage, somewhere near the aft magazines and fuel bunkers that shouldn't have been directly threatened yet. The torpedoes hit forward and amidships. The explosion came from the stern, That's not how fuel vapor ignition works. Vapor doesn't migrate backward through sealed compartments against ventilation flow. It follows air currents, spreading forward or upward, not aft into undamaged sections. The mystery deepens when you consider what Japanese carriers were dealing with by mid-1944. Fuel shortages were forcing operational compromises across the fleet. Pilot losses were unsustainable. Air groups sailed undermanned while carriers still loaded fuel for their design capacity. Whether Shokaku carried a standard fuel load or made adjustments based on her reduced air complement remains unclear from surviving records. But the gap between doctrine and reality was widening across the Imperial Navy. So when Kavala's torpedoes hit, they struck a ship operating in conditions her designers never anticipated. Fuel systems designed for peacetime logistics, now supporting a failing war effort. Damage control procedures written for a navy that expected to win, applied by crews who knew they were losing. The secondary explosion might have been inevitable design flaw meeting battle damage, or it might have been improvisation and desperation creating vulnerabilities that shouldn't have existed. Was Shokaku's sinking the result of American marksmanship, or did the Imperial Navy's deteriorating strategic position, forcing ships to operate beyond their intended parameters, contribute to her destruction? The crew went down with the answer. The wreck holds it now, in ruptured fuel tanks and blast patterns frozen in twisted steel. But only if we can find what should be exactly where the charts say it is. And 80 years of searching suggests the charts might be lying, or the ship moved, or something about that sinking defies every assumption we've made about how carriers go down. Modern deep-sea technology has located battleships, cruisers, and even Shokaku's sister carriers in the same Pacific abyss. Yet she remains invisible, raising questions about whether something down there defies the surveys or whether we've been searching in the wrong coordinates all along. The Pacific Wrecks database, maintained by researchers who've spent decades cataloging WUT losses, notes that Shokaku's wreck remains undiscovered despite the general area being known. Kavala's navigation logs place the attack with high confidence, cross-referenced against celestial navigation star sightings and dead reckoning calculations that submariners literally staked their lives on every time they surfaced. But oceanographic analysis suggests that a ship breaking apart during a 3-hour sinking, bleeding fuel and air, shedding aircraft and debris and bodies, could scatter across undersea terrain we haven't fully mapped, even now. Bathymetric studies of the region, conducted by NOAA and Japanese oceanographic institutes, show a seafloor that's anything but uniform. Undersea ridges running north-south, trenches that drop another 1,000 meters below the average depth, volcanic vents that periodically deposit fresh sediment across square miles of ocean floor, terrain that could hide entire sections of a broken carrier if the hull separated during descent, if currents carried pieces miles from the initial impact point, if the ocean decided to keep this particular secret. Here's where forensic history gets complicated, where the clean narrative of torpedoes hit, ship sank, wreck is at these coordinates, breaks down against physical reality. Wreckage of the Akagi and Kaga, both found in the last decade after years of searching, showed distinct debris fields based on how each ship died. Akagi, scuttled by Japanese destroyers after Midway with torpedo strikes to an already damaged hull, landed relatively intact at 18,000 feet. Her hull was broken but recognizable, settling upright with her island superstructure still visible to ROV cameras. You could identify her from the footage immediately. There was no question you were looking at a carrier, at a specific carrier, at a piece of history that matched archival photographs. Kaga, gutted by internal explosions from American bomb hits that set off aviation fuel and munitions, shattered into recognizable but separated pieces across a square kilometer of seafloor. Her forward section landed 300 meters from her stern, connected only by a debris trail of hull plating and equipment. Her flight deck fragmented into slabs of steel half the size of tennis courts, scattered like playing cards thrown from a rooftop by a giant hand. But even fragmented, she was identifiable. The pieces added up to a coherent picture of destruction. If Shokaku's secondary explosion was powerful enough to erase her radio transmitting capability, her final message cut off mid-sentence, mid-word, according to American intercept logs. Then the internal force may have broken her keel during the sinking, compromised structural integrity that was already weakened by Coral Sea repairs that were never quite good enough. A split hull would create 2 or more separate debris fields, possibly miles apart at that depth, each two fragmented to match sonar profiles of an intact carrier. that search teams are programmed to recognize. What searchers might be looking for: a single, recognizable silhouette on a sonar screen. The kind of clean image that makes for compelling documentary footage and clear identification may not exist. Instead, there might be pieces scattered across terrain that make systematic searching nearly impossible. Sections of flight deck here, resting against a volcanic ridge. Engine room machinery there, settled into a trench that current maps don't show. The bow separated from the stern by a canyon no one's surveyed yet, because the search grids all assume she sank in one piece, the way carriers are supposed to sink. Or there's another possibility that no expedition team wants to consider, because it would mean every search conducted so far has been fundamentally flawed. What if she's there, whole and waiting, but buried under sediment from 80 years of Pacific volcanism, ash and silt raining down from undersea vents at rates we can only estimate, accumulating in layers that would completely obscure a steel hull from sonar imaging? What if every survey has been scanning 30 feet above her, reading the seafloor as empty because the ship is under it, not on it, hidden beneath sediment that looks identical to the surrounding seabed? And if that's true, then finding Shokaku won't be about better sonar or more precise coordinates. It'll be about excavating the Pacific itself, one grid square at a time, hoping the ocean hasn't claimed her so completely that she'll never be found. Beyond the engineering questions and search failures, Shokaku's wreck is a war grave for 1,272 men, whose final moments were never fully documented, and whose personal artifacts, if ever recovered, would force a reckoning with the human cost hidden inside imperial narratives. Survivor testimonies, archived by the Naval History and Heritage Command and Japan's Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, describe crew members trapped in flooded compartments as the ship listed, unable to reach escape ladders that had become vertical shafts as the deck tilted past 45 degrees. Water was pouring in through torpedo holes, through ruptured hull seams, through ventilation shafts that became conduits for the ocean itself. Flight deck personnel, mechanics who'd kept aircraft flying with salvaged parts, armorers who'd loaded bombs by hand, plane handlers who'd pushed fighters into launch position, were last seen trying to jettison aircraft to reduce topside weight, a futile effort as the carriers list passed 30 degrees and physics made the decision for them. They were working until the moment the deck went vertical, still trying to save a ship that was already gone. Among the lost were pilots from the 601st Air Group, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, and a dozen smaller engagements that never made it into the history books. Men who'd survived 3 years of combat, who'd dodged American fighters over a dozen different islands, who'd landed on pitching carrier decks in tropical storms, only to die because their own ship's fuel system turned against them in 3 minutes of catastrophic fire. Their flight logs and personal effects went down in officers' quarters that would now be sealed under pressure no human could withstand without specialized deep-sea equipment. Letters from Imperial Navy personnel serving on carriers during this period, preserved in various family archives across Japan, describe conditions that steadily deteriorated through 1944, rationing that reduced meals, rumors of American submarine activity that proved all too accurate, the carefully neutral tone that military censorship required, describing weather and routine duties, while the strategic situation collapsed around them. Men writing home about card games and calm seas because acknowledging fear or doubt would dishonor the service and endanger family members. That restraint, that refusal to name the dread that must have saturated every berthing space and passageway, speaks to what a discovery might expose. If the wreck is ever surveyed, if ROVs equipped with high-definition cameras penetrate intact compartments that have been sealed for 80 years, they'll find more than corroded steel and collapsed bulkheads, diaries written in careful script, tucked into waterproof cases that failed when pressure exceeded their design specifications, photographs of families in traditional dress, standing in front of houses that American firebombing would erase a year later in raids on Tokyo and Yokohama and Osaka. Hinamaru flags signed by school children who believed their carrier was invincible, who were taught in classrooms, draped with propaganda posters that Shokaku was a floating fortress that could never be sunk by inferior American technology and industrial capacity. Letters never sent, written in the hours before the battle, sealed in envelopes addressed to parents or wives or children who would spend decades not knowing exactly when or how their sailor died. Personal effects that seem trivial until you imagine them in context. A photograph of a child who's now in her 80s, a wedding ring engraved with a date, a pocket watch stopped at the moment its owner went into the water and pressure crushed the mechanism. These objects would carry stories the Imperial Navy never wanted told. The mundane terror of serving on a ship everyone quietly knew was a priority target. The gap between propaganda, which promised inevitable Japanese victory and divine protection for the Emperor's sailors, and the reality of dwindling resources, irreplaceable losses, and a strategic situation that had already turned hopeless by the time Shokaku sailed into the Philippine Sea. And if those artifacts ever surface, either through ROV recovery or authorized scientific documentation, Japan will face the same question every nation with sunken war graves has confronted. Do you leave the dead undisturbed in the name of respect, or do you recover their stories before the ocean's slow corrosion erases them completely? Do you preserve the myth of the honorable warrior dying for emperor and nation? Or do you acknowledge the human being who was scared and following orders in an unwinnable situation? There's precedent for this tension playing out in public and in international courts. When Robert Ballard surveyed the USS Yorktown in 1998, American veterans groups split over whether ROV footage of the wreck honored the dead or violated their final resting place. Some argued that documentation preserved memory. Others said cameras had no business filming men's graves. The same debate erupted over the Bismarck, over HMS Hood, over every warship that's become simultaneously a historical artifact and a metal tomb. And Shokaku would carry an additional weight that those other wrecks don't. She was at Pearl Harbor. Her aircraft killed American sailors who never had a chance to fight back, who died in their bunks or drowned in capsized hulls or burned in oil fires on the water. So any discovery would have to navigate not just Japanese cultural sensitivities about war graves and family honor, but American institutional memory of December 7th, 1941, and whether the ship that launched that attack deserves the dignity of undisturbed rest. Shokaku's crew didn't choose to become a mystery. They were just men following orders on a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, sailing under directives from an empire that couldn't publicly admit it was losing a war it had started. Somewhere in the dark, 17,000 feet down, their ship waits with all the answers we keep looking for. And until someone finds her, we won't know if her final secret is in the blueprints we've been studying for 80 years, in the fuel system that was always a calculated compromise between range and safety, or in something simpler. A hatch left open in the chaos, a valve that should have been closed, a decision made in the last 12 desperate minutes that nobody survived to report. The ocean knows. The wreck knows. But we're still searching in the wrong place, or at the wrong depth, or 80 years too late to recover anything but ghosts and metal. 3 torpedoes, 4 explosions, 80 years of silence. The math still doesn't work, and that's another story.